Hello, welcome to the Story in Life podcast. I'm Dale.
And I'm David. Okay, so over the past couple weeks, we've talked about
Months.
Yeah, past while. A while ago we talked about mourning loss, and we talked a little bit about Adventist history and how Adventism grew up out of the Great Disappointment. Last week we talked about the significance of story and how story shapes our lives. So I want to sort of connect those, and this will explain a lot of the things that something major to both Dale and my thought, the idea we call the Great Controversy. And this is a narrative. I think this is in many ways the singular contribution of Adventism to Christian theology. Is this, and what the Great Controversy is? I guess that's the good place to start this. What the Great Controversy is an understanding of a narrative understanding of history and God's role in history. And that really came directly out of the Great Disappointment and the Second Great Awakening and the Advent message and all these things.
Well, I mean, at least it was foregrounded through those periods of history. I mean, I wouldn't argue that it was a new concept necessarily, maybe just a more...
It was more fully developed.
Yeah.
I mean, anything we talk about, and I often use this in any of my writing, there's always the disclaimer that nothing happens in isolation.
There's nothing new under the sun.
It's not nothing new under the sun, but things develop and grow from what has gone before.
Yeah.
And so to talk about narrative is to say that things have come before that we have to understand. You can't just say we're here in the middle of the story and this is the beginning. No. We're in the middle of the story, which is to say something has come before, and we may not have time to talk about that. But in this case, we do. There's many ways to tell the Great Controversy. I guess one beginning, this is my beginning, Dale tells the story a little bit differently. But for me, I looked as the Great Controversy is in many ways a reading of human history. And it extends beyond that, and Dale will get to that. But starting in Genesis, it explains the significance of Genesis, of creation, of what is commonly called the fall. And I think we talked about that with Brian McLaren, that's not necessarily a particularly apt term. But what happened in Eden, what happened that our world now is so warped and broken, and we live with so much pain and alienation and loss that we seem to recognize doesn't belong to life, as doesn't fit in life. It seems an aberration, even as it is very prevalent. That's not the word I'm looking for. Ubiquitous. I mean, loss is ubiquitous, and yet we still have this feeling that it shouldn't be that way. And so it's this, and follows on through sort of Hebrew Jewish history, through Christ and the early Christian church, and then on up to our day and into the future. So, do you want to start with your introduction then, before I get your beginning? Maybe.
Okay. My
how's
beginning.
The story begin for
how's
you?
the story beginning? Begin for me? Well, I'd say like any good work of fantasy literature. You have a backstory, so to speak. And
some things that should not have been forgotten were lost.
Yes, exactly. As Tolkien says, and there's you look at all of the great fantasy sci-fi writers of today, like Sanderson, Rothfuss. They all the catch term is world building, and what they're respected for is their ability to create a cohesive, believable narrative that ties everything together. And my understanding of the narrative of the Great Controversy has always been that this is our backstory, our present story, our future story. It's the grand arc, it's the thing that ties everything together.
So where does it begin?
So it begins...
I guess I should clarify.
Historically,
part of
or
the Adventist reading.
Yeah.
Part of the Adventists arrived at this understanding on the shoulders of those who came before, particularly in terms of Daniel and Revelation.
Mm-hmm.
And arguing that prophecy is not merely funky animals and mythical imagery, but there's actually historical. This actually relates to history. This actually relates to the way we live. It's not just some sort of mythical fantasy trip.
Yeah. So I guess the place to begin would be with a couple Bible verses, and the first would be the second time the term "in the beginning" is used. I mean, in the same way that what's his name now? Is it
John Eldridge.
John Eldridge tells a
In
story.
Epic.
In Epic, he says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning from God. And with these words, he sets out the sort of the...
And that's from John the Apostle.
John the Apostle,
Gospel in the Bible.
John 1, verse 1. And setting out a state at the beginning of time-ish where all was well. And there was the angels, there was, kind of you could say the pantheon, or the heaven as it's described in the Bible. And then in Revelation,
what do you mean by that, heaven as is described in the Bible?
Oh, that's because I didn't want to get up. That's because I didn't want to get in and describe it all. It's not much. There's not really all that much said. But,
what I would say.
Okay, you say it.
I think the idea is that heaven is a place, a concrete place, not some.
Yeah, not a place. Yeah.
Not a mind trip again, but also that heaven is a place with people in it. Maybe not human people, maybe not.
But beings.
Yeah,
time.
Beings, yeah.
And it's also in time.
It's not this empty, vacant headspace. It is a literal place with literal people. And we have very little detail about that.
Yeah.
But needless to say, there's a context and there's a social, a universe-wide or a cosmic social context to Earth.
Yeah. And within this context, within this place with people, we have the story of Lucifer. And within Isaiah, there's the story about how he became prideful of his position, and jealousy, and essentially a conflict began that over the question of what was the best way to live, to exist, what was the best way to live life, what was the narrative that should shape how we view our relation to others, what was God to the other created beings. And within this, the beginnings of this question, whether the one narrative was the right way or the other narrative that was the right way, that takes us to the point where we read in Revelation 12:7-9, and there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, the ancient serpent called the devil, or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him.
And that, I guess, that basically then gets us to Genesis, more or less.
The next in the beginning.
Something I want to add here that's critical is this is not a literal reading. This is a narrative reading, which is to say, to connect that to history is not to say it happened absolutely in all those details as written, but to say that this is a story that makes sense of things. Even if, I guess in the way that any telling, I mean, we talked about this, reading the Bible as nonfiction. That's what this goes back to. The idea that when you tell a story of your life, it is at some level a shaped story. It may not be exactly detail by detail as it happened, but it is more or less accurate, and it represents relationships and critical moves in that narrative approach. Yeah. Anyway, so that takes us to Genesis. So Lucifer has been sent to our planet. We don't actually know why he ends up here. There's speculation that he may have had access to all planets, and our planet was just the one that listened to him and gave him room to and invited him to stay.
Yeah,
I guess. But yeah, we go to Genesis. In traditional, what's traditionally called the fall, but that's not a really apt term. But basically, this idea that
so God had created Adam and Eve, and they're in the garden, and there's this tree, and God says you're not supposed to eat of this tree.
And God creates humanity good.
Yeah,
God creates this world that isn't full of pain and loss.
God sees, saw that it was good with everything that He created.
Yeah. But then He leaves the choice of relationship or not, and that's where Satan shows up, and starts to say, well, is God really like that? Or is God? God's just trying to control you. He just wants to take away your freedom. He just doesn't want you to be like Him.
You will not surely die.
Yeah, he's a liar and a dictator and a power mad dictator.
If you wish to
And
explore this question
self-absorbed.
further, please eat fruit B.
Fruit A.
Fruit
Yes.
A.
Yeah, pretty much. It
And-
starts by touching it.
Yeah.
But yeah. And so humanity does, and we end up on this path that is not what was originally intended
Mm-hmm.
and is broken. And yet, even in that, God is working.
Yes.
And that's, I think, foundational, this idea that God is continuing to work. And then we have this story that picks up with God works with Adam and Eve. He comes to them after they've fallen, after they've eaten the fruit, after they've sinned and invited Satan to stay. He still comes looking. This is, where are you?
Yeah.
What's going on?
He doesn't say, "Oh, you've sinned. Now I'm going to kill you." He says, "Okay, we now have to deal with this,
Yeah.
and so I'll give you a promise. I'll tell you a little bit about the future, so you have something to think, work towards." How does it go?
Well, as the Genesis account goes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll create enmity between you and the serpent, and I forget how.
Yeah.
He will bruise your heel, and you will bruise his head.
Let's look it up. There's a particular, it's a pretty neat and dense little formulation. Blah, blah, blah. So the ground is now not going to just give food without work. You're going to toil. Childbirth is going to be painful, which is interesting. From now on you and the woman will be enemies, and your offspring and her offspring will be enemies. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel.
That's speaking to the serpent.
Yeah. I mean, the King James says he will bruise his heel. And this is read, picked up by Matthew, I think, one of the gospel writers, and connected to Christ.
Mm-hmm.
It's a specific he. It's not just a general he.
You're not, sort of like C.S. Lewis's son of Adam, as he always calls him.
Yeah, but it's a specific that somebody's going to come and end the reign of the serpent, potentially.
Mhm.
Not potentially.
And-
it is going to come.
And this goes back to the idea that from the initial conflict, we believe that God had a plan in place, which we generally call salvation, or the plan of salvation, of
Yeah.
an idea to set the world right. And then through history, through the Bible, he made promises to Adam and Eve, and he made more promises to Noah, and then specifically we usually pick up the story again with Abraham.
Yeah, God continues to work with humanity. Abraham.
And he says, how's it go? I'm trying to remember exactly what the promise is. From your seed will come one who will save his people from their sins? No.
Through your seed will all the nations of the earth
Be blessed?
be blessed.
That's how it goes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to make a great people, but through your seed all the world will be blessed.
The child of promise.
So God is not just working with Abraham, picks Abraham from among the Gentiles. before there's anything like a Hebrew or a Jew,
Uh-huh.
and says, I'm going to work through your family to bless the world.
And
then many things happen, and there's Jacob and Esau, and Joseph and his brothers, and eventually, Israel ends up in Egypt, and then God is here all along. He's talking to them, working with them, continually involved. But the next signal moment happens when he takes Israel out of Egypt.
Yeah.
And shows up and says, I am the God. And this is a wonderful passage. There's all kinds of interesting philosophical and theological implications. But I am the God of your fathers. I am the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob. And I have come to bring you out of Egypt, and I will take you to Canaan. And so he's this God in time, that he's the God of the past, the present, and the future. But and then he picks up Israel, makes a nation of them, again under the Abrahamic promise that I will use you to bless all nations.
Yeah.
And outlines them this way of life that they are meant to share, which is, and a ritual, a system of rituals that has narrative import, that tells a story about, in a way, it tells a story about who God is and what He's doing in the world. And I think this goes back to Abraham. I mean, Abraham's told to sacrifice Isaac, and gets up there, and God says, "No, don't kill him. Do not do human sacrifice. use the ram instead. There's a substitute. I mean, this is a foundational text for penal substitutionary atonement, which I have issues with. But there is another who will die for this. But also this idea that human sacrifice is not acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
God's trying to shift that, and so he continues to do that with Israel. He comes and says, "Don't be like the other nations. Don't do their practices. Do these ones. Wash your hands before you eat. Eat meat that's not going to be full of parasites. Don't eat certain animals because they're not particularly good for you. Wear clothing that's made out of one material because it's going to last longer." And there's much more to Levitical law than that. But a lot of it was tied to very practical concerns.
And some of it came from both directions, so to speak. It wasn't. There was also. There's always a mixture of God and humanity, so to speak. I mean. Yeah,
it's always very contextual. It's God speaking into the time, speaking into history.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't come and tell them, okay, so what you need to do is establish a democracy, and so that means we're going to have voting. And so you guys need to elect some people to be candidates.
And here are my angelic voting machines.
Yeah, and you guys need to establish a public education system, and that's going to be community funded. And you'll have to figure out how to do that, but you need to do that. And so you also need to have a community health system. Not if you're American.
And here's the curriculum. Here's the curriculum you can use.
Yes, he doesn't do that. He says, okay, this is where you're at. Let's take a step.
Mm-hmm. And then at some point, specifically at around 0 AD or BC or year 1.
Well, before we get to that,
yeah, okay,
because I think there's a lot that happens before that. There's this ongoing story that God is continually involved with Israel, trying to shape them as a nation.
Mm-hmm.
To some degree, they're not really willing to cooperate.
And when they are most unwilling to cooperate, God often sends prophets.
Well, even when they're willing to cooperate,
mm-hmm.
prophets come and judges come, and eventually they choose a king, and all these things happen, and eventually Israel they're like, forget it, and they get into trouble, and they get taken captive. Jerusalem is destroyed. Most of the Israelites are either dead or taken to Babylon or Syria, other places. And at that point we have Daniel, and Daniel's critical to this because Daniel's book is much prophecy. There's very practical things in there as well, but there's the time. These huge time prophecies are set out as Adventists understand it, which outlines the rise and fall of kingdoms from Babylon on through Rome and the fall of Rome, but also this bigger time frame that God is working. God has always been working. That the exile is for 70 years, as Jeremiah prophesied, and from this point of return up till Christ, there's a timeline, and then after that, there's timelines, and there is this historical working out of God's plan and God's involvement with humanity, and that leads us up to about 0 BC.
Yeah,
which is the signal event of God's involvement in history.
When after having sent prophets to reveal his character and having revealed him through all these other leadings.
I guess it's 0 AD. Well, there isn't a 0
There
AD.
isn't a 0.
It's 1 AD.
Yeah, or often argue 4 BC.
Potentially, yeah.
Potentially. When God comes himself and is like, okay, let's make the story a little bit clearer, or let's,
Yeah.
And within two things. On the one hand, he's continuing this tradition of revelation that's been going on since he talked to Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, he's coming to show who he is through his actions.
Yeah. I think we talked about this in an early podcast, I think. That Christ's ministry makes sense because of the narrative in which he's situated. That Christ, because I've had people ask, well, could Jesus have come somewhere else? And well, yeah, he could have, but he came, I think part of the reason he came in Israel is because there was a narrative context then to what he was doing. That he could go and, there was this whole story about the sacrificial lamb and the blood of atonement and all these kinds of things that pointed to Christ.
Mm-hmm.
From the Jewish temple ceremonies and stuff that were pointing to Christ and what Christ was going to do. And so Christ comes and says, this is what I'm doing. That story is about me. Where he couldn't have done that in a different culture that didn't have that story.
Yeah, and there was a context into which he could speak, into which he could share all of the stories that he shared, and and as he taught about what it meant to live a good life, to have life more abundant, there was a context within which he could situate all of his statements that could reinforce a particular narrative, a particular understanding of history, a particular understanding of a story about how to interpret the stories of the Bible, about how to interpret life and what happened, and how to move forward in our lives that he had available to him.
And this is actually, as sort of an aside here, this is a pretty significant point. That Christ was not the introduction. Christ was a new element, and again, a signal intervention. I mean, God appeared in a way he had not done before. And yet, that was not a break. It was not like, nothing that happened up to this point matters. Now there's Christ, and we start there, and the story starts over again, which is how some Christian theologies understand it.
The Old and the New Covenants.
But yeah, there's readings that say, well, there's the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, and they're totally different. God works with us in different ways. No. Within the great controversy, I understand the Adventist argument, and I think it's a good biblical argument. Christ only makes sense because of what God had already done with the Jews, with Israel. And because of the promise to Abraham, and because of the promise to Adam and Eve. And Christ is not the beginning of a new story. Christ is a signal event in this story that has been ongoing for millennia.
And an important part, if we think about millennia, let's go back to the very beginning. And our understanding of what this controversy is about is the question of what is the better... we understand within this there's two questions. One is, which is the better way to live via God's narrative, essentially based on love, or via Lucifer's narrative of, you could say, enlightened self-interest, or I guess we'd say selfishness or pride. What actually leads to the better world? There's the one question, and the second question is God really who he says he is, or is he actually living within the world that Lucifer has described? And with Christ's coming, a function of that is also to answer that same question. Christ comes in, and he doesn't come as God. He comes as humanity, as a very embodied, frail person, and says, "I will be who I am, even when I am weak, even when I am you."
And yet he does come as God, and I think that's critical in this narrative, I guess, in this approach.
Well, he's fully representing God.
Yeah, and this is the problem. I mean, we've talked before about the omnis. The problem with the omnis, especially in open theism, our discussion with Steve, there's this sense that what God is outside of our reality. And Christ comes, and Christ is human, and Christ is vulnerable, and Christ needs to eat and sleep and go to the bathroom and wear clothes and all these things. And yet he's still God, and he can still be God in spite of being in our reality. And it doesn't change who he is. And that's a very different picture of God than some people tell.
Because within the story, within this narrative, the central aspect of God is not his power to...
it's not his power.
It's not his power. The central aspect of God is his character.
Yeah.
And if God, you're understanding at this point, the critical aspect of this moment is if Jesus, representing God or as God, were to do something that was not within how that was different from how his character has been described in the Bible, that wouldn't be grounds to say, well, Jesus isn't God. That would be grounds to say, wow, so God isn't God.
Yeah.
So God is
a liar. God is a liar.
God lives by the exact same rules as what he's been accused of, and what Lucifer, the light bringer, is. So
and in the end, he's no better than we are. And
we should all just go with it and
look out for ourselves and amass power, because it really is about power.
Or else we need to find a different God who is worthy to be served.
Potentially, yeah. But let's move on from there.
Yeah.
Because there's still a lot of story to go, and this is, I think, where Adventism starts to come into its own. Mm-hmm. It's not to say that we came up with the ideas. These are ideas that go back at least to Luther and have been developed in various ways. But I guess one point of taking up is Christ, before he dies, he weeps over Jerusalem and says, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how I long to gather you under my wings," as basically a hen would for her chicks. But you would not. And he says, basically, Jerusalem's going to be destroyed. The temple is going to be torn down. AD 70, that happens. Rome comes back and obliterates everything.
Mm-hmm.
The temple burns and is torn down, and it's more or less, it's the end. It marks the end of the Jewish nation as such. But then you have this Christian story that develops, and there's a lot of complexity over that. I guess the way to take this up, and that marks the end of Daniel's first prophecy.
Yeah, and I guess I could say that,
Somewhere around
remember,
there.
what is the destination of this narrative that we're telling? The ultimate destination is a solution to sin and a restoration.
Which, yeah,
And
that's
so
true.
everything we've been telling has been working towards that point. So
Yeah.
with Christ on earth, he established, he made it much clearer who he was, and he also established that he was who he said he was.
Well, I think he also is, and this is the atonement is a huge and complicated discussion, but there's a sense where what Christ did, even in his death, is the means of our salvation. And we can discuss that another day, how that actually works, what that means. But there's a sense where it was necessary, and his coming and his being here and what he did here opens salvation for us, opens the possibility of reconnection with God and reconciliation and atonement. But yeah, but it's not over. That's not the end of the story. It's not Christ came and died and went to heaven and that's the end. God is continuing to work, there is an ongoing plan that there are things yet to happen, and eventually Christ is going to come back. And even that won't be the end of the story, but that's more or less the end for what we know.
And I could go back in time once more.
Okay, we need to keep moving.
Yeah, and say that we should establish who are the players in this. Now, we've talked about God and Lucifer and the angels and humanity, but we also understand that there's other beings in the universe, and
Inquiring minds
need to know. Exactly. And so this solution, as a narrative solution, and as a solution that's not an expression of power, this conclusion that we're working towards has to be something that is completely satisfactory for these inquiring minds. It has to make sense.
And so this actually relates to Lord of the Rings.
Mm-hmm.
That the core of everything in Lord of the Rings revolves around these hobbits, but the hobbits aren't the story. As much as they are Lord of the Rings, there's this sense that this is a much bigger drama.
Mm-hmm.
What Frodo does with the ring, what Frodo does on Mount Doom, has implications for all of Middle Earth. It's not just a story about a hobbit with a ring. It's a story about this ring that and this power that and this conflict and this narrative that impacts the world. And I think it's very similar here, that humanity is in some ways the center of all this, and yet it's not our story. We're just the ones caught with the ring, and we have to choose what to do with it now. But what we choose and how this plays out has ramifications on a larger scale.
Yeah, and how people view us afterwards, and how people view the one who let us have the ring, so to speak. These questions have to be answered in a way that makes sense within the narrative of history. It can't simply be an expression of
one that answers all questions.
That answers all the questions.
Yeah,
it has to be a good ending. It can't end like the Third Hunger Games. But
anyways, haven't read it, haven't seen it. No, I know it yet. Anyways, so but this story continues, and so we have after Christ dies, the Christian church arises and spreads, and yet even in that, Satan also is working, and so this new message spreads, but then we have these movements. I mean, Constantine's blamed for a lot of it, and I think possibly rightfully so. But there's a connection starts to happen between the church organizes and becomes not a community; it becomes an institution. And as an institution, it gets tied up in state politics. And you have the development of the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, which follows after Rome and becomes starts to build an empire and has a capital city and a ruling God, so to speak, or mediator between God and man, one mediator.
And it has a framework that is very much based on authority, and the idea that God has authority, and God passed that authority on to Peter, and Peter passed that authority on to his not his predecessors, his postdecessors. Well, yeah.
There's a line, but but particularly significant about this is that they come to enforce Christianity by power.
Yes.
And Christianity is grounded in power, which inverts the entire story.
Yeah, when your entire story is based on it's all centered around the narrative of a God who comes to present his story without power.
Yeah.
And whose whole goal, of all the narrative is to be able to come to a resolution of this question over what is the best way to live, what is the best way to run the universe, and tries to do it through a narrative without resorting to power. Believes it crucial to. Then when you try and tell that story through power, you've undone it. Yeah.
And so we have Luther, and he's another signal event, not in the scale of Christ, but the Protestant Reformation. And what's interesting about that is there were many voices. God was always, I guess that's the other part of the story, is God was always working through this history. There were always people that were challenging this picture of God, that it was about power. Adventists often talk about the Waldenses, but there were others. There were dissenting voices along the line. And then you have Luther, who says, this is not what it's about. It's about what God does for us, and it's not about fear. And then he starts this line of thinking that then develops, and you have Calvin, and you have Zwingli, and you have other reformers, and then Wesley picks it up.
Huss and Jerome before Luther.
Huss and Jerome, and that eventually develops up to our day. And actually, maybe not quite up to our day. We'll get to that in a bit. But up until the end, 1798 is a critical year, because it's the year that Napoleon marches into Rome and exiles the Pope, takes it over and says, forget the Pope, throws down Catholic power as such, and marks the beginning. Some people say it marks the beginning of secularism, the rise of secularism. And then you have the Great Earthquake in Lisbon, you have the Dark Day, all these things happening. People start to wonder, even, secular minds, Voltaire and people like that were writing against the church because the church had become so tangled up in power and oppression, saying something crazy is happening. The world is doing things that we cannot comprehend. There are forces at work, and maybe the end is near. And so they went back to the Bible and started studying these prophecies. Over the next 50 years, you have this development of an understanding that something significant is going to happen in 1844. There are these time prophecies that go back to the decree to rebuild Jerusalem, I think it's 438 BC, unto 2300 days, and then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Goes up to 1844, and William Miller is the signal voice in this, but there are others around the world that were speaking it. And he says, Jesus is coming back in 1844. The story is going to end. This is the antitypical Day of Atonement.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to see because they understood the temple, the cleansing of the sanctuary was going to be earth.
Yeah. And
earth is the center of everything. And so Christ is going to come back and clean the earth, and the end.
But there was,
and
by this
point,
after. The view of God in history had become, the dominant view had become the view of God out of history.
Yeah.
In other words,
because of Augustine bringing Platonism in. And that was hugely influential on especially Catholic Christianity, but that was pretty much the dominant Christianity for millennia.
Yeah, the idea that this idea of an end to our story didn't really make sense if we had a God who was without time, and the stories, the narrative that was embraced by people like Miller was very, very contrary to this view, and it faced a lot of resistance.
Yeah. God is still working in our history, and God is going to come back in our history, and it's not going to be an abstract arrival at paradise. It's going to be a literal redemption of creation, of humanity, of our planet, and a restoration in time. Yeah. But, and this is where we get to the great disappointment. Everybody was waiting for Jesus to come back, and he didn't. And it was a
story we told two podcasts ago. Right?
Yeah. Needless to say, it was a bit of embarrassment.
Yeah.
And a huge loss. But as Adventists continue to think on this, and many people just said that's the end. The people that became the Adventist Church, this is the better way to say it, became the Seventh-day Adventist Church, said no, God did do something. Our understandings were solid, but maybe eventually got to we didn't understand the sanctuary well enough. And what is significant, God is not doing something on earth. God is not, it's not about this, it's about this huge picture that's playing out on a cosmic scale. Like the Jews thought it was all about the temple, and God is going to come back and redeem the Jewish nation, even though God said, I'm going to redeem all mankind. And the Advent believers And the people who were looking for Christ to return were like, well, it's all about our planet. We're the center of the story, and we're the end of the story. When Frodo throws the ring in, Frodo can go home, and that's the meaning of the story. Is Frodo gets to go home. And it's no, that's not the end, that's not the meaning. There's a bigger conflict happening that has yet to be resolved. And yet, yeah. And that gets really complicated, and we can possibly explain that later.
Yeah, but this, you could say this takes us to the end, because what the next step where the story is going is, many people say the second coming or judgment day. It's a phrase gets thrown around, and there's this concept that we have that at some point when we die we'll be judged. And within the context of this story, that idea of judgment has a much greater meaning. When you realize that at the end of this narrative, it's not just us having our lives questioned. It's God. Primarily it's God. It's this
controversy
is being decided, and so the central question, even at the end, is not how obedient have you been?
No,
at all. It's what conclusion has your life led you to in regards to this central question? And your life is meaningful, not just to you.
And this we talked
to the
about.
Whole universe. Yeah.
If nothing we do matters, all that matters is what we do.
Yeah.
What is the narrative weight of your life? Not merely what have you done, because you have to measure up to some, God's scorecard, some divine score sheet, and get all the test questions right. But what is the narrative import of your life? What is the meaning of your life?
Yeah.
And what have you done with?
What does your life say about this question?
Yeah. Well, and it's more than that. It's not just referring to this big question. I think there's a sense where what we do does matter. Yeah. Because of the impact it makes on the people around us. But
yeah, and it matters.
All
I
tied
guess
up in
what's saying is that what we do matters not just to our well-being, which is part of what God wants for us and part of that revelation. It also matters for the well-being of others. It matters for
Frodo throwing the ring in the thing didn't just save his own life.
Yeah, it was significant with everybody who had a relationship with Frodo, with the ring, with the story. Everybody who was caught up with that. Yeah. Frodo's actions were significant. And the same can be said about our actions today, is that our actions are significant, not just to us, but to everybody who has any connection to creation.
And not because somebody's sitting there and saying, well, did he throw the ring in the Mount Doom? No? Okay, Frodo fails. That wasn't the meaning of what Frodo did. The implication of the ring is very profound and real and concrete.
He didn't throw it
That's
in.
That's true, actually. Yeah. Golem board in.
Yeah.
But anyways, so there's still this end of the story playing out. That God's character, there is still a conflict. And I've argued, I argued at UVic in one of my classes that I think our world is still wrestling with this question of how do we relate to people? Is this system of detachment and disconnect and power viable? Because if it's viable, then Lucifer was really right. Satan was right. If it's not viable, if the only way to live is to live in community, in vulnerability, in love, then that difference needs to be settled. And our society, I think the world as a whole is wrestling with that. Not just Christianity.
No,
but there's this struggle. Are we going to recognize people? Are we going to love them as people in spite of, whatever? Or are we going to shock and awe them into submission?
Yeah, and I think every single podcast we've done has in one way or another been connected to this question of, do we view life as the sum of our relationships?
Yeah.
And
our stories.
Interconnected, and the important things of life are, to what extent are we vulnerable to each other? To what extent can we be impacted by each other? To what extent can we impact the world? Or are we viewing it from the perspective of what can the world, I would say, do for us? But what, Yeah.
Well, are we connected or are we not?
Yeah.
Are we only human to the degree that we can go beyond, transcend our connections and pursue power and control? And so that's the great controversy. I think I guess that's not the ending. We should say that the end is that eventually this is going to be settled. It's going to be clear that one way works. Mm-hmm. And Christ is going to return. And
following that return,
eventually
there will be an earth made new.
Eventually, Earth creation will be restored. And it won't merely be that God imposes things on us, but that we will have realized that there is only one way to live. That it is about connectedness and love and vulnerability.
And
God will live in a world where that will be possible, because there won't be people who
and we will be given the choice of eternal life, with now having a full realization of what that entails and a full realization of what it means to live in a world founded on God's character is revealed. It will not be an imposition. It will be the ultimate informed decision.
Yeah.
And those who choose against
can
opt out.
Yeah. There's always an opt-out clause. But the question will be settled. Yeah. And it won't be an issue anymore. And
as we've looked, this story, within this story, just not even to go into them, but to say this story has implications for how you view the question of, is God just? For if you ask the question, can God be loving when there is sin and suffering in the world? What else? Like, there are so many things.
So many, and we'll be addressing, I think, some of those, and we'll probably get to all of them eventually.
Yeah,
but we're going to address a few of them directly in the next couple podcasts.
Yeah,
pull out some of the major themes in this discussion.
Yeah, all right.
Well, thanks for listening. This one's been a little longer, but this is a pretty significant discussion. So thank you. If you found us somewhere randomly online, our website is at tanshi.blogspot.ca,
taanshi.blogspot.ca,
or at the Storing Life group on Facebook.
Thanks for listening.